What I think I have to start by saying is that whatever we might hope for, we are not going to save all the world's remaining rainforests. And this might seem like a very pessimistic place to begin, but I think if we start from that assumption, we probably stand a better chance of getting things right in the longer term. And I hope by the end of my presentation, I'll have been able to convince you that this isn't quite as pessimistic view as it might at first seem. A second basic point I want to make is that, and again reflecting some of the points that Warren made earlier, that I think it's really important that we understand the reasons why rainforests are being destroyed, and not simply to target the proximate agents of deforestation. There have been many attempts to tackle the destruction of rainforests over a number of decades, and many of them major and expensive efforts. And the fact that we're here this evening asking the question, how are we going to save the rainforest, I think is probably evidence enough that these have not succeeded. Thirdly, I'll argue that I believe we have to set aside many of the preconceptions that we have previously had about how to save rainforests and indeed who is succeeding in doing so. Many of the lasting solutions, I believe, are quite counterintuitive. And much of what I believe we have been told and we've understood about saving rainforests has quite simply been wrong. And it's here, I think, that I'd like to start, and really just to try to set the scene a little bit for some later thoughts on what I think needs to be done to protect rainforests. It probably hardly needs saying to a knowledgeable audience such as yourself that rainforests are for much the large part not uninhabited or uninhabitable. And in fact, many areas of rainforest are currently occupied by people, in fact have been for many thousands of years. But there's more, and that is that evidence is starting to accumulate that not only has there been a long history of human occupation of rainforests, but at least some areas that we consider to be the wildest places on Earth, in fact, have been heavily modified by human agencies, and in some places even created by it. One of the better-known examples of this was research by the ethnobotanist Darrell Posey, who showed how the Kayapo in the eastern Amazon region had created forest through the planting of groves in savanna areas, and you can see examples of this just about in this picture here. And there's similar evidence of the importance of human agency in large parts of the Congo Basin region, the second largest rainforest on Earth, where extensive slash-and-burn rotational farming has been practiced for more than 3 millennia. And researchers are now beginning to believe that, quite counterintuitively, this farming has actually helped forests to form, and principally by suppressing more intense fires that destroy any forest growth or regeneration. Of course, in some areas, slash-and-burn farming, and I suspect this is one of the issues we'll be discussing later on, slash-and-burn farming is causing deforestation, although I'd be interested to know from Warren where the figure of about two-fifths, I think it was, of all deforestation being due to these practices actually comes from. But the consequences of all this, really, the point I want to make is that in terms of how we consider the future of forests, I believe this is quite profound because, firstly, deforestation is not all it sometimes appears to be, and some forests are not as natural as we might like to think. And I think at the very least, I believe we have to think of rainforests as continuing to be human-inhabited ecosystems, and it is almost certainly human presence that is likely to secure them in the future. And when we consider that an estimated 1 billion of the world's poorest people on the planet depend on forests for at least a part of their meager livelihoods, we realize that we have to start by addressing the human requirements of forests. And this really brings me to my second theme, which is to ask why we have not succeeded so far in tackling deforestation. And I believe that these previous efforts have largely failed because they've tended to address the symptoms of deforestation rather than the underlying drivers of forest loss. And one of the basic failures, I think, has been to fail to understand this role, this critical role of people in forests, and particularly these people's systems of tenure, of rights and control over their local environment. This, I believe, has been a failure of the last 3 decades or more of international and national policies and plans to protect forests, where we arrive at the situation where now, sorry, I'll just jump through this, most rainforests have, to all intents and purposes, been carved up into one of 2 uses. That's strict protection for nature, or use for industrial exploitation of timber. And just let's look at both of these things briefly. I don't want to launch into a long description of why strict conservation of rainforest doesn't work and probably won't work in the future. Others have already done so. There are good protected area schemes in rainforests, and there are less good schemes. But I think we have to realize from the outset that many such schemes are likely to prove unsustainable in the long term. So far, many have relied on international aid programs for support over indefinite periods of time, and unsurprisingly, aid agencies are increasingly unwilling to enter into open-ended funding arrangements. And experience has tended to show that once the international funding for these strictly protected areas stops, so they quickly collapse into their former imperiled state or worse. And where these parks have relied on effectively armed militias to protect them, as in here in the Congo Basin region, as they often have done, the gamekeepers quickly tend once again to become poachers. And worse still, local communities who have formerly relied on the forest for their livelihoods have often been displaced and brutalized by these so-called eco-guards. And in some parts of the world, there are already substantial numbers of what we could call conservation refugees who have been evicted from strictly protected areas, such as these people in the eastern Congo. And in fact, we're still busily creating large numbers of rural people who are fundamentally opposed to forest conservation because of the negative impacts it's had on them. Secondly, industrial-scale timber exploitation is not a sustainable way of managing forests, and the whole belief that it might be is based really on the use it or lose it approach. That being that if the forest isn't valued for careful and selective timber extraction, which with the right kind of technical tweaks can be, it's said, minimally damaging to the forest. If this doesn't happen, then the forest will simply be cut down completely and turned into farmland. The problem is that there's no evidence anywhere, really, that this approach actually works. In fact, everywhere in the rainforest that has been subject to long-term timber extraction is now no longer forest. There are a few exceptions, but they're relatively insignificant. As one eminent forester once said to me about so-called sustainable timber extraction from rainforests, it's sustainable until it's gone. Extraction of timber requires very heavy machinery, which causes very serious collateral damage to the remaining forest. You can see the kind of impacts in this picture here. The tracks and the roads that have to be opened up are an invitation to poachers who remove the animals and birds from the forest that this forest relies on for seed dispersal and regeneration and so on. And most importantly, by breaking open the forest canopy, logging allows sunlight and warmth to enter into the forest, and also leaves a lot of debris lying around, and thus creates the perfect conditions for catastrophic forest fires. And in fact, research in the Amazon has shown that almost all rainforests that burned down were previously subject to so-called selective logging. So the real course of events with this so-called sustainable management for timber tends to be to use it and to lose it. So my view is that we have to explore some different alternatives to this rather limited kind of binary paradigm, if you like, of strict conservation or industrial logging. And I think many of these are going to depend on communities. And actually, just to give my own organization a little plug here, this is exactly the kind of approach that the Rainforest Foundation has been taking for 20 years, be it helping local communities in the Congo to map their traditional lands and to gain rights to them, as you see here in these pictures, or in Peru, where having already secured land, helping indigenous communities to establish sustainable livelihoods, from small-scale woodworking to women's enterprises to planting new high-value crops. But more generally, we have to find ways, I believe, and again, the point was made very well by Senator De Silva, find ways of dealing with the underlying problems of land tenure and overcoming the crushing poverty that many forest communities have to endure. So this really brings me back to where I started and why I think it's terribly important to appreciate that we're not going to save all the remaining rainforests. And I just want to explain why I feel this is particularly important for us to appreciate at the moment. As was mentioned by Warren earlier on, and particularly through the work of Sir Nicholas Stern, amongst others, the need to protect tropical forests has gained a lot of international significance recently because of the realization that deforestation is one of the major contributors to the emission of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. And if you believe, as most scientists seem to believe, that this is causing climate change, then it appears that rainforest destruction is causing about the release of 1/5 of all greenhouse gas emissions. Indeed, that's more than every single car, lorry, bus, and ship on the planet. And it appears that we're running out of time to stop these emissions before climate change unleashes dangerous and possibly irreversible changes to weather patterns on the planet. But here is the danger, and my fear is that in our haste to address climate change, we rush into what might superficially appear to be quick fixes to the problem of rainforest destruction, but which actually might make matters worse. And it's frequently been said that the cessation of tropical deforestation will be the quickest and the cheapest way to prevent carbon dioxide emissions. And one of the latest big ideas, as it were, suggests that money for rainforest protection could be generated if large producers of greenhouse gases in rich countries like our own are allowed to carry on polluting just so long as they invest in preventing tropical deforestation instead. And it's suggested that such a scheme of trading in these kind of forest protection credits or carbon credits of one kind or another could start as soon as 2012, and that it could quickly generate tens of billions of dollars for forest protection. But I think we have to realize that almost every major of the tropical forest countries faces major challenges in terms of governance, and lack of clarity about the laws, very uncertain ownership of forest lands. In Brazil, for example, I was told by a Brazilian government official recently that 96% of people living in the Amazon region have no legal tenure to their land. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, the situation is almost certainly as bad, if not worse. And many of these countries, of course, have desperately little capacity either to manage and conserve their forests or to absorb large amounts of money and mobilize it effectively. And Brazil may be one exception to this. But this is to give you an idea of the scale of the problem we're faced with here. This is the office of the provincial head of forestry in Equateur province in Democratic Republic of Congo, an area covering 400,000 square kilometers, or about twice the size of Britain. I mean, and note carefully what you see here: a man, a bicycle, and a typewriter, because that is all there is. And Democratic Republic of Congo hasn't, as a whole, hasn't trained a single forester in the last 10 years. So under these kinds of circumstances, and this isn't unusual in many parts of the world, how do we think we're going to ensure that large or huge amounts of new money is going to find its way to the right people, the communities on the ground, as Senator De Silva was mentioning earlier on, those who actually decide whether forests stand or fall, and not be swallowed up by ever-hungry central bureaucracies? How will these countries actually start to manage their forests and conserve their forests sustainably. So my fear is that the only way that anything can be done quickly is probably to repeat the same kinds of approaches that have been tried before, top-down command and control approaches that have almost entirely failed, but only they'll probably fail on a much bigger scale. So to come to my conclusions, I think it will certainly take money to tackle deforestation, though it certainly won't help simply to throw money at the problem. Mega plans to save rainforests will not succeed. Not yet, anyway. There is no silver bullet for this problem. I think in the short term, we need to support a diverse range of approaches, especially practical efforts on the ground that have been shown to work in the past, and particularly those based on securing land for local communities and helping them establish sustainable livelihoods. I think we need less big plans. I think we need more sewing machines and wood workshops. We need to help tropical country governments to reform their forestry policies, changing the rules of forest ownership, rooting out corruption, and strengthening their ability to conserve their forests. And above all, we're going to need political willing, lots of it. One of the most promising trends, I think, is that the amount of forest that is under the control of communities worldwide is increasing steadily. This is something that should be encouraged. We will lose forest whilst all this is happening, but at least we'll be laying some sound foundations for the future. And I just want to leave you with one last image, which will no doubt be familiar to Marina da Silva, showing deforestation in the Amazon region. And you'll see this broad arc of deforestation across the southern Amazon basin there. But you'll also note that there are some significant gaps in where this deforestation is occurring, here, here, and over here. If you then add in the legally designated and protected indigenous territories in Brazil, you will see what it is that's actually serving to prevent deforestation in that country. So thank you very much for listening, and thank you very much to the RGS for inviting me to speak this evening.